Recently, we've seen Scott Morrison apologise for denying that Australia had any sort of history of slavery. He had to backtrack on that. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were around that in terms of our history and also the ideas around uh, reparations.
Yeah, it's really good that you asked both, because I think until we get our history right, it's really difficult to move to the necessary phase of addressing reparations. My thoughts about Scott Morrison's initial comments, which denied that slavery existed here, were really whitewashing a lot of the history we have in Australia in relation to our treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as South Sea Islander people and other minorities, Chinese people and other groups that tend to be whited out of our history, that only focuses on, particularly British settlers that came here. And that's not to say that, as for instance, convicts, they were given fair conditions, because we know the criminal justice system can be excessively harsh. But I think by denying slavery, he was denying a narrative that speaks to the practices of how, especially First Nations people, were treated. And this was labour and employment practices that spanned over a century. So from about the, in pearling, it began in the early 1800s, and then for the cattle industry, where they were heavily employed, it lasted from about the 1860s to the 1950s in Australia. And there they were not only exploited for their labour, but equivalent to slavery, they were owned in their entire being. So the employer had control over their marriage, over their relationships, over where they moved, over how they spent their money, if they got any. Rarely they did in their employment. So these were whole scale powers that were also state sanctioned under the Aboriginal Protection Acts, where the employer could, with the permission of the pastoralist, with the permission of the Aboriginal protector under the Acts, could employ as many Aboriginal workers as he saw fit and treat them with all the powers under the Aboriginal Protection Act. So it was really far-reaching in terms of the controls. So when you talk about reparations, I think there's still a lot of work to be done with stolen wages, because many of them were not paid. And when I went up to Kalkarinji and Dagaragu and Lajamanu, which are right in the Tanami Desert in Australia, some of the old people were still with living memories of these experiences and still wanting their stories to be told, but also wanting the wages that have been denied to them and kept them in poverty as a result of that denial, being intergenerational, really, and explains, I think, why our nation's so rich, because many of these cattle corporations profited, and yet Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people remain so poor.
So the reparations are essentially directly to the people who either experienced that injustice, or the family members of the people who are descendants of that injustice as well?
Yeah, when we've looked at reparations schemes, and there's been a number, as you can imagine, of inquiries
Yes.
into reparations and stolen wages, as well as stolen generations, and often the two classes overlap.
Yes.
The recognition of this intergenerational poverty means that it should not only be given to the workers themselves, but also their children and grandchildren, and the debt owed is the debt owed to the family. So when they've looked at establishing schemes, and there's been various types of schemes in New South Wales and Queensland and Western Australia, some of them have, and the more effective ones have, compensated descendants, but none of the schemes have actually compensated people who've worked in these corporations necessarily. So often it's government employees, and the government has gone some way to pay them, only generally, and ex gratia payment, which is a very small